I want to divorce my cheating husband, but the husband of the other woman showed up and gave me $100 million, saying, don't divorce him just yet. Just wait for 3 more months. I found out about the affair on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that looks harmless enough to trick you into believing nothing bad could happen. The sky was pale, the coffee machine hummed the way it always did, and my husband Daniel stood at the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone with the casual ease of someone who believed his life was intact. I noticed it only because he stepped away to take a call, leaving the phone face up on the marble. A woman's name appeared, followed by a message that had no reasonable explanation. It wasn't graphic. It didn't need to be. It was familiar in a way that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. My body reacted before my mind did. A tightening in my chest, a heat behind my eyes, a strange sense of recognition rather than surprise. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. Something old and quiet inside me had just been proven right. When Daniel came back into the room, I looked at him and saw a stranger wear my husband's face. He smiled, leaned down to kiss my cheek, and asked if I wanted eggs or oatmeal. That was the moment I knew I would never unsee what I'd just seen. I asked him one question, keeping my voice steady, because I refused to give him the relief of chaos. Who is she? He froze. Not dramatically, not guiltily, just enough to tell me everything. His eyes flicked toward the phone, then back to me, calculating. He tried denial first, then confusion, then the version of the truth that was shaped to minimize damage. An assistant from work. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. He loved me. He was sorry. I listened until he ran out of explanations, and then I told him I wanted a divorce. The word felt unreal in my mouth, but also inevitable. Like naming a storm that had been building for years, he reacted exactly the way people do when they assume regret should earn forgiveness. He begged, promised therapy, offered transparency, said he would do anything. I told him it was too late. Not cruelly, not angrily, just honestly. By that afternoon, I had called a lawyer, packed a small bag, and checked into a hotel across town. I expected grief. What I felt instead was a hollow calm, like the quiet after something collapses and before the dust settles. For 3 days, I lived in that space, signing papers, ignoring calls, letting the reality of divorce take shape. Then, on the 4th night, there was a knock at my hotel door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, there was a man standing there who didn't belong in that hallway. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with the posture of someone used to being listened to. He introduced himself as Michael Grant. He said he was the husband of the woman my husband was sleeping with. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. He asked if he could come in. Every instinct told me to close the door. Instead, I stepped aside. He didn't sit until I did. He spoke calmly, without accusation or apology, explaining that he knew about the affair, that he had known for some time, and that he wasn't there to threaten or negotiate on anyone's behalf. He said he was there to make me an offer. Before I could respond, he slid a document across the small table between us. It was a bank confirmation, official and unmistakable. $100 million had been transferred into an account in my name. I laughed, because the alternative was losing control completely. I told him there must be a mistake. He shook his head and said the money was real. Mine to keep. No repayment. No legal strings. Only one request. Don't divorce your husband yet. Wait 3 months. The words hung between us, absurd and heavy. I asked him why. He didn't hesitate. Because divorces end stories too quickly. Because some people only learn when they believe they are safe. Because patience, applied correctly, is more devastating than anger. He stood, wished me well, and left before I could ask another question. I sat there long after the door closed, staring at numbers that didn't feel real and a future that no longer made sense. I called the bank. The money was there. I called my lawyer, who told me to say nothing to anyone and do nothing yet. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the moment, wondering what kind of man gives a stranger that kind of power and what he expected me to do with it the next morning. I went home. Daniel looked relieved when he saw me, as if my presence meant forgiveness. I didn't correct him. For the first time in years, I watched instead of reacted. I noticed how quickly he relaxed, how easily guilt gave way to routine. I noticed how careful he was for exactly 3 days before slipping back into comfort. And somewhere between that first breakfast and the end of the week, I understood that what Michael Grant had given me wasn't just money. It was time. Time to see clearly. Time to decide who I was without panic. Time to let the truth unfold without interference. I stopped thinking about divorce as an escape and started seeing it as a conclusion I didn't need to rush. I began to wait. Living back in the house felt like returning to a stage after the audience had gone home. The furniture was the same, the light fell through the windows at the same angles, but the meaning of everything had shifted. Daniel moved through the space with cautious optimism, as if my return meant the worst had passed, and the rest could be smoothed over with enough patience and effort. He tried harder than he had in years, cooking dinners he'd once dismissed as my responsibility, asking about my day with a careful attentiveness that felt rehearsed. I accepted it all without comment, understanding instinctively that my reactions were now more powerful than any accusation. Silence, when used deliberately, unsettles people who rely on reassurance. Daniel mistook my quiet for sadness, and sadness, he believed, would fade. He didn't recognize the difference between withdrawal and observation. I watched him closely, noticing patterns I'd ignored for years. The way he apologized in bulk rather than in detail, as if remorse were a single payment that covered all debts. The way his promises were framed around future behavior instead of past harm. The way he avoided specifics, hoping sincerity would substitute for truth. At night, when he slept beside me, I lay awake and listened to the house settle, thinking about how easily comfort had replaced accountability. I didn't mention the money. I didn't mention Michael Grant. That secret felt heavy, but also clarifying, a reminder that I was no longer operating from a place of scarcity. I had options, and options change how you breathe. During the day, I began making small adjustments that had nothing to do with Daniel. I reopened a personal bank account, something I'd closed years ago at his suggestion for the sake of simplicity. I scheduled lunches with women I hadn't seen since before my marriage began to contract around his career. I started running again in the mornings, not to lose weight or prove resilience, but to feel my own momentum. Each small act reinforced something I had forgotten. I existed independently of this relationship. Daniel sensed the shift before he understood it. He started checking in more often, calling during the day for reasons that sounded casual but weren't. He asked what I was doing, who I was with when I'd be home. Each question carried an unspoken fear beneath it. "Are you leaving?" I answered kindly, but vaguely, careful not to offer reassurance I didn't mean. Too much warmth would have allowed him to relax. Too much distance would have triggered suspicion. I stayed balanced between the two, learning the rhythm of restraint. It surprised me how quickly he began to unravel when I stopped managing his emotions. He talked more, filling the space I no longer rushed to occupy. He complained about work, about pressure, about feeling unappreciated. He framed the affair as a consequence of loneliness rather than a choice, as if circumstances had acted through him without his consent. I listened without interrupting, letting him build a narrative that justified his behavior. The longer he spoke, the clearer it became that he needed to believe he was still a good man. That belief was his shield, and eventually, it would be his weakness. I asked gentle questions that sounded like curiosity, but functioned as mirrors. "How long had you felt that way? Did you ever consider telling me? What did you think would happen if I found out?" Each question loosened another thread. He didn't notice. He was too busy explaining himself. Meanwhile, the money sat untouched, a quiet presence in the background of my thoughts. Knowing it was there changed everything, not because I planned to use it, but because it removed fear from the equation. I was no longer negotiating from a position of dependence. Security, I realized, isn't about wealth. It's about the absence of desperation. Halfway through the month, Daniel made his first real mistake. He grew careless. The careful version of himself he'd adopted when I returned began to slip. He stayed out late one night without explanation, came home smelling faintly of cologne he didn't wear for me anymore. Another evening, he took a call outside in the cold, pacing the driveway as if distance could protect him. I didn't confront him. I didn't need to. His behavior spoke louder than any confession. One afternoon, I answered the house phone, something no one ever did anymore. There was breathing on the other end, then silence, then the line went dead. When I mentioned it casually to Daniel, he denied knowing anything about it, but his eyes flicked away too quickly. I felt no surge of pain, no jealousy, only confirmation. That night, as I lay in bed, I understood something with startling clarity. Waiting wasn't passive. It was active restraint. It required discipline, attention, and a willingness to tolerate discomfort in service of truth. I was learning more about my marriage in stillness than I ever had in confrontation. By the end of the first month, I wasn't counting down days anymore. I was paying attention to them. I was watching who Daniel became when he believed he had time. And I was watching who I became when I stopped rushing toward resolution and started choosing clarity instead. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing with certainty. I would never again confuse endurance with love or silence with weakness. The second month began with a subtle shift in the air, the kind you don't notice until you realize you've been breathing differently for days. Daniel grew more attentive and more agitated at the same time, an exhausting combination that revealed how little control he actually had. He wanted reassurance, but he didn't want scrutiny. He wanted forgiveness, but he didn't want consequences. Those desires conflicted, and the tension leaked into everything. He started asking questions he hadn't earned the right to ask. Are you happy? Do you still love me? Do you think we're going to make it? I answered each one honestly, but incompletely. I'm fine. I care about you. I don't know. The uncertainty unsettled him more than anger ever could. Anger gives people something to push against. Uncertainty forces them to sit with themselves. He began filling the silence with effort, gestures that were meant to prove commitment, but only highlighted how transactional his remorse had become. Flowers appeared without occasion. Dinners were planned with exaggerated care. Apologies resurfaced at odd moments, as if repeating them often enough might eventually turn them into truth. I accepted everything politely, understanding that my reaction mattered more than his intent. Inside, I was calmer than I had ever been. The fear that once dictated my responses was gone, replaced by a steady patience that surprised me. I noticed things I had never allowed myself to notice before. How often Daniel spoke about sacrifice without naming anything he had actually given up. How easily he described the affair as something that happened to him rather than something he chose. How quickly his frustration surfaced when he didn't receive immediate reassurance. One evening, he said something that clarified everything. He told me he felt punished by my distance, that my quiet was harder to bear than my anger would have been. I looked at him and realized he wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of losing the version of himself that felt safe and admired. That distinction mattered. Around that time, I began therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted language for what I was discovering. My therapist asked me when I had first learned to minimize myself to keep peace. The answer came faster than I expected. Long before Daniel, long before this marriage, the affair had exposed a fault line that already existed. Waiting had given me space to see it. I stopped framing this experience as something being done to me and started understanding it as something that was revealing me. Daniel's unraveling accelerated once he sensed I was no longer emotionally anchored to his reactions. He talked more compulsively, offering details I hadn't asked for, explanations that contradicted each other. One night, he admitted he was still in contact with her. He said it was complicated, that ending things abruptly would create problems at work, that it didn't mean anything. I watched him closely as he spoke, noticing how he waited for my response, how much he needed it to stabilize him. When I told him I was disappointed, but not surprised, something in him cracked. He asked if I was angry. I said no. He asked if I was hurt. I said I had been, but that hurt had a way of changing shape when you stopped feeding it that he didn't know what to do with that. From then on, his behavior became erratic. Some days he tried harder than ever, attentive to the point of suffocation. Other days he withdrew, resentful that his efforts weren't producing the outcome he wanted. The contrast made one thing unmistakably clear. His remorse was conditional. It depended on control. I continued building my own life, quietly alongside the marriage I was observing. I joined the advisory board of a nonprofit I had admired for years, something I'd postponed repeatedly because it conflicted with Daniel's schedule. I reconnected with parts of myself that had gone dormant, not out of neglect, but out of accommodation. The more I expanded, the smaller the marriage felt. I met Michael Grant again near the end of the second month, at his request. He looked the same as before, composed and unreadable, as if nothing in his life ever required urgency. He asked how I was holding up. I told him the truth. Waiting was harder than leaving, but infinitely more instructive. He nodded, as if confirming something he already believed. He didn't ask if I planned to keep my promise. He simply said something that stayed with me long after we parted. Waiting doesn't just reveal who others are. It reveals who you're willing to be. On my way home, I thought about that. About the woman I had been when this began, reactive and desperate for resolution. About the woman I was becoming, deliberate and unwilling to rush clarity for comfort. Daniel was unraveling, but that was no longer the point. The real shift was internal. I was no longer organizing my life around his choices. I was organizing it around my values. With 1 month left, I felt no urgency. Whatever happened next would not be an ending forced by betrayal. It would be a decision shaped by understanding. And that made all the difference. That be why the time the third month began, the balance between us had quietly inverted. Daniel hadn't noticed it yet, not fully, but he felt it. It showed in the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking, in the sudden seriousness with which he treated casual conversations, in the way his confidence thinned whenever I didn't respond the way he expected. He was still operating under the assumption that time favored him, that proximity meant progress, that my continued presence was evidence of forgiveness slowly taking shape. What he didn't understand was that time had already done its work, just not in his favor. I was no longer gathering information. I was confirming conclusions. The house felt smaller now, not because of tension, but because I had outgrown the version of myself who once made it feel like home. I moved through my days with a quiet decisiveness that Daniel mistook for emotional fatigue. In reality, it was resolve. I stopped explaining myself entirely. If I went out, I didn't justify it. If I declined plans, I didn't soften the refusal. Each boundary I set without apology unsettled him more than any argument ever had. He began to realize, dimly, that the rules had changed, though he couldn't articulate how or why. His attempts to regain control became more transparent. He tried nostalgia, reminiscing about trips and moments he believed proved our bond. He tried vulnerability, confessing fears and insecurities he'd never shared before. He even tried jealousy, asking pointed questions about my schedule, my friends, my sudden independence. None of it worked. I wasn't cold. I was neutral. And neutrality, I learned, is devastating to someone who relies on emotional reactions to feel anchored. The affair continued in the background, less hidden now, not because he was bold, but because he was careless. He believed I had accepted it as a complication we would eventually overcome. That belief allowed him to relax, to assume the danger had passed. He underestimated the clarity that comes when you stop bargaining with reality. One evening, he left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he went to shower. I wasn't looking for anything. I didn't need to be. A message preview appeared, sharp and impatient, demanding reassurance, expressing frustration at being sidelined. The tone wasn't affectionate. It was entitled. I closed the laptop and felt nothing but a quiet sense of alignment. Everything was exactly as it appeared. Later that night, I asked him directly if he was still seeing her. He didn't lie, not because he had become honest, but because he believed honesty no longer carried consequences. He told me yes, that it was complicated, that he was trying to manage the situation carefully. I listened, then told him I appreciated the truth. The relief on his face was immediate and misplaced. He mistook my composure for acceptance. In that moment, I understood something important. He wasn't afraid of losing me. He was afraid of disruption. As long as his life continued largely unchanged, he believed he was safe. That belief was about to cost him everything. I began preparing quietly. I reviewed documents with my lawyer, not to file yet, but to understand every option available to me. I moved money discreetly, not the 100 million, but smaller amounts that re-established my financial autonomy. I updated records, changed passwords, reclaimed pieces of my life that had been slowly absorbed into the collective identity of marriage. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. Power rarely announces itself. It accumulates. Daniel sensed the distance widening, but misread its cause. He accused me once of being emotionally unavailable, of punishing him by withholding affection. I told him calmly that I wasn't punishing him. I was simply no longer performing reassurance I didn't feel. That answer lingered between us, unsettling and unresolved. A week later, he asked me if I was still planning to divorce him. The question carried an edge I hadn't heard before. Fear had finally crept into his voice. I told him the truth. I hadn't decided yet. That answer destabilized him completely. He had expected either forgiveness or rejection. Indecision left him without a script. He became anxious, volatile, alternating between desperate affection and quiet resentment. Watching him struggle to adapt to a situation he could no longer control clarified everything for me. This wasn't a man capable of partnership. This was a man dependent on certainty and admiration, neither of which I was willing to provide anymore. I met Michael Grant one final time near the end of the month. He asked me one question and only one. "Are you ready?" I didn't answer immediately. I thought about the woman I had been when he knocked on my hotel door, wounded and reactive and eager for escape. I thought about the woman I was now, steady and unhurried, no longer motivated by fear or urgency. I told him yes. He nodded once, as if that was all he needed to hear. We didn't discuss the money. We didn't discuss plans. We understood each other without explanation. When I returned home that evening, Daniel was waiting for me, restless and alert. He asked where I'd been. I told him I'd been taking care of things. He didn't ask what things. He didn't want the answer. For the first time since this began, I felt no doubt. The waiting was over, not because the time had passed, but because the lesson had been learned. Whatever came next would not be reactionary. It would be deliberate, and he would not see it coming until it was already done. The decision didn't arrive like a thunderclap. There was no cinematic moment where everything snapped into focus at once. It came quietly, almost gently, on an ordinary afternoon when I realized I no longer felt the need to explain myself to anyone. That was how I knew I was ready. Daniel, meanwhile, was spiraling in small, undignified ways. He tried to hide it, but his confidence had thinned to something brittle. He asked more questions than before, not because he wanted answers, but because he was trying to reassert relevance. "Where are you going? Who are you meeting? Why didn't you tell me?" I answered each one calmly, without irritation or reassurance. "I'm going out. I have plans. I didn't think it was necessary." Each response landed like a closed door. He began sleeping poorly, pacing the house at night, waking me once to ask if we could talk because he felt distance. I told him we could talk later. Later became a concept he hated. He wanted immediacy, resolution, relief. I was no longer interested in any of those things on his schedule. The affair, once something he believed he could manage discreetly, started bleeding into his daily life. Calls came at inconvenient times. Messages arrived with an urgency that suggested impatience rather than passion. I saw the strain it put on him, the way he was being pulled in two directions by women who no longer centered him the way he needed. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I had contorted myself to maintain harmony. Now he was discovering what it felt like to juggle expectations without control. I didn't confront him. I didn't threaten. I simply allowed reality to apply pressure. One evening, he accused me of being manipulative, of staying while emotionally checking out. The accusation would have hurt once. Now it only clarified. I told him the truth. I wasn't manipulating anything. I was observing. That answer enraged him. Observation meant judgment without engagement, and he couldn't tolerate that. He wanted to argue, to provoke a reaction he could use as proof that this was still a two-person conflict. I refused. The next day, I met with my lawyer again. not to finalize the divorce, but to prepare the moment when truth would be introduced without negotiation. We reviewed assets, timelines, disclosures. We talked strategy, not revenge. Clarity was my only objective. That afternoon, I finally touched the money. I didn't move it. I didn't spend it. I simply logged in, confirming once more that it was real, that it existed independently of Daniel's knowledge or consent. The weight of it wasn't intoxicating. It was grounding. It reminded me that whatever happened next, I would not be bargaining from fear. I planned the reveal carefully, not because it needed theatrics, but because timing matters. I waited until Daniel believed the tension had plateaued, until he relaxed into the assumption that things were bad but manageable. That night, we sat across from each other at the dining table, the space between us filled with unspoken calculations. He asked again if I was going to divorce him. I told him yes. Not yet, but yes. He started to speak, to negotiate, to plead. I stopped him. I told him this wasn't a discussion. It was information. I explained that I knew the affair was ongoing, that I knew it had never ended, that his belief in my tolerance had been a miscalculation. He tried denial reflexively, then stopped when he realized it no longer mattered. I told him I'd been given 3 months to wait, and that those 3 months were almost over. That was when his face changed. He asked who had given me that time. I told him the truth. The husband of the woman he'd been sleeping with. He laughed at first, disbelieving, then fell silent as the implications began to surface. I told him about the money. Not the amount at first, just that it existed, that it was mine, that it had nothing to do with him. He asked how much. I told him. The room went very quiet. He asked why. I told him the same thing Michael Grant had told me. Because divorces end stories too quickly. Because some lessons require time. Because patience can be more devastating than anger. He accused me of setting him up. I told him no. He had been entirely free to make his choices. I had simply chosen to wait before making mine. He asked if I planned to keep the money. I told him yes. That was never in question. He asked what would happen next. I told him I would file for divorce at the end of the 3 months. That the terms would be fair but final. That I was done negotiating my worth. He tried to argue, to reframe, to remind me of our history. I listened without interrupting, then told him history wasn't a justification. It was a record. That night, he didn't sleep. Neither did I. But for the first time since this began, my restlessness wasn't rooted in fear. It was rooted in momentum. The truth had been introduced. The waiting had done its work. And the final act was no longer hypothetical. It was scheduled. After the reveal, the house felt different in a way that couldn't be undone. It wasn't tense in the dramatic sense. It was hollow. Daniel moved through the rooms like someone who had misplaced something essential and couldn't remember when he'd last had it. Control had always been his invisible anchor. Even when things went wrong, he believed he could negotiate his way back to safety. Now that illusion was gone. He had information but no leverage, and that imbalance rattled him more than betrayal ever had. He tried to regain footing by talking, endlessly, filling the silence with logic and emotion tangled together. He apologized again, this time with urgency rather than strategy. He promised to end the affair immediately, swore he would do anything if I reconsidered the timeline. I listened, not because I needed to hear it, but because I wanted to observe what desperation stripped away. What remained wasn't accountability. It was fear. He wasn't mourning the marriage. He was mourning the loss of his assumptions. The following days were marked by small, frantic gestures. He cooked elaborate meals I didn't ask for. He canceled work events to be home, hovering as if proximity might restore relevance. He asked me what I needed, what he could fix, what would make me stay. Each question revealed the same misunderstanding. He still believed this was a problem to be solved, not a reality to be accepted. I told him nothing had changed since the conversation. The timeline stood. My decision stood. The more he pressed, the calmer I became. That calm unsettled him. People expect anger when they've done damage. Calm suggests preparation. It was clean, irrevocable, and none of his concern. That answer cut deeper than I expected. Money had always been his quiet measure of security, the thing he assumed bound us together. Knowing it existed beyond his reach terrified him. A week later, he admitted something he hadn't planned to say. He told me the other woman was pressuring him, demanding clarity, threatening to expose things if he didn't choose her. The irony was almost unbearable. He had built his life on managing perceptions, and now both versions of it were turning on him. I didn't comfort him. I didn't offer advice. I told him that sounded like a consequence. That word landed hard. Consequence was something he'd always managed to avoid. Now it was unavoidable. His anger surfaced thin, sharp, and misplaced. He accused me of orchestrating this, of humiliating him, of turning his mistake into a spectacle. I told him quietly that the only spectacle had been his belief that actions exist without outcomes. He stormed out that night, not to be with her, but to escape the house that no longer validated him. When he returned hours later, he was subdued, stripped of bravado. The next morning, I filed the paperwork. Not the final divorce documents, but the formal notice that set everything in motion. I didn't tell him I was doing it. I didn't need to. The process no longer required his awareness to be real. That same week, I met Michael Grant one last time. He didn't ask how Daniel was reacting. He didn't ask if I was satisfied. He asked if I felt clear. I did. He nodded, satisfied, and told me something I hadn't expected. He said the money had never been about punishment. It was about removing urgency. People make poor decisions when they feel trapped. I wanted to see what you'd do when you weren't. That reframed everything. This hadn't been a transaction. It had been a test of agency. I passed it not by acting, but by waiting. When I returned home, Daniel was packing a bag. He said he needed space. I told him that was probably wise. There was no argument, no plea, just resignation. As he left, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Relief. Not relief that he was gone, but relief that I no longer had to manage his emotions. The house was quiet in a way that felt earned. I sat alone that evening, thinking about how easily I could have rushed toward divorce in pain and fear, and how much that would have cost me in understanding. Waiting had been uncomfortable. It had demanded restraint and discipline, but it had given me something far more valuable than closure. It had given me certainty, and certainty doesn't need to announce itself. It simply moves forward. Once Daniel left, the silence settled differently than it had before. It wasn't charged or expectant. It was complete, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask to be filled. For the first time in months, my days unfolded without the need to monitor another person's reactions. I woke when I wanted, ate when I was hungry, left the house without explanation. The freedom was subtle but profound, like discovering an extra room in a house I'd lived in for years. Daniel tried to reinsert himself in small ways at first. Text messages that sounded practical but were really emotional probes. Questions about logistics that could have been answered by his lawyer. Casual comments meant to remind me of shared memories. I responded only when necessary and only with facts. No warmth, no hostility. Neutrality had become my natural state, not a strategy. That, more than anything, unnerved him. I could feel it even through the screen. People who are used to emotional access struggle when it's revoked without drama. Meanwhile, the consequences of his choices began to unfold beyond our marriage. The other woman, no longer content with ambiguity, demanded commitment he wasn't prepared to give. She wanted certainty the way he once had, and when he couldn't provide it, she turned volatile. I learned this not from him, but from the quiet reverberations of gossip that always follow situations like this. Mutual acquaintances stopped inviting him to things. His professional circle tightened in ways that weren't overt but were unmistakable. Trust erodes invisibly before it collapses publicly. I watched all of it from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. This was what happens when you build a life on assumptions instead of integrity. I didn't need to intervene. Reality was doing its work. I focused instead on rebuilding parts of myself that had been deferred for years. I traveled alone for the first time in over a decade, choosing destinations without compromise. I spent money deliberately, not extravagantly, savoring the absence of guilt that had once accompanied every indulgence. I invested time in friendships that had survived my absence patiently, waiting for me to return to myself. The money remained mostly untouched, but its presence continued to shape my choices. It was a reminder that independence isn't about excess. It's about insulation from fear. Daniel eventually asked to meet in person. Not to reconcile, he said, but to talk. I agreed, not because I owed him closure, but because I no longer feared conversation. We met in a public place, neutral and unremarkable. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but energetically. Stripped of the confidence that had once carried him, he spoke carefully, as if each word might trigger something irreversible. He apologized again, this time without performance. It was the most honest I'd heard him sound, and it came too late to matter. He asked if I hated him. I told him no. Hate requires investment. I asked if I regretted waiting, if I wished I'd just divorced him immediately. I told him the truth. Waiting had been the most instructive choice I'd ever made. It allowed me to leave without confusion, without bargaining, without doubt. He nodded, absorbing that in silence. There was nothing left to negotiate. The final paperwork was filed a week later. The divorce was clean, efficient, almost anticlimactic. No drawn-out battles, no public spectacle. The marriage ended the way it had functioned for years, quietly, without ceremony. The difference was that this time, I wasn't shrinking to make it easier. As the dust settled, I thought often about Michael Grant and the strange role he'd played in my life. We never spoke again after our last meeting, and that felt appropriate. He had offered me something rare, not money, but perspective. He had trusted me to use time wisely, and I had. That trust changed how I saw myself. I was no longer someone who reacted to betrayal. I was someone who chose a response. People around me noticed the change, even if they couldn't name it. They said I seemed calmer, more grounded. They said I carry myself differently. I felt it too. Not as confidence exactly, but as alignment. I was no longer performing a role that required constant adjustment. I was simply myself, unburdened by the need to be understood or approved. Looking back, I realized the affair had been the least interesting part of the story. The real transformation happened in the waiting, in the space between impulse and action. That was where I reclaimed myself. I didn't emerge victorious in a way that demanded applause. I emerged intact, and that was more than enough. In the weeks after the divorce became official, I noticed something unexpected. People around me were far more unsettled by my calm than they had ever been by my pain. Friends who had rushed to comfort me early on now seemed unsure of how to engage. They asked fewer questions, offered fewer opinions. It was as if my refusal to frame the experience as tragedy or triumph disrupted the roles they knew how to play. I didn't correct them. I had learned that not every silence needs to be filled, especially when it protects something still forming. The truth was, I was still learning who I was without the constant low-grade tension of managing another person's expectations. That kind of unlearning takes time. I spent long mornings alone with coffee and no agenda, something that would have once made me anxious. I realized how often my worth had been measured by usefulness, by how well I anticipated needs and smoothed friction. Without that metric, I had to build a new one. Waiting had taught me patience, but it had also taught me discernment. I no longer rushed to label feelings or situations. I let them unfold, observing how they changed over time. That skill proved invaluable as Daniel attempted, once more, to reframe our story. He told mutual friends that we had simply grown apart, that the divorce was mutual and inevitable. I didn't correct him. His version didn't threaten mine. I understood now that people rewrite history to survive it. Letting him have that narrative cost me nothing. The real work was internal. I thought often about the early days after discovering the affair, how urgent everything had felt, how desperate I'd been for resolution. Waiting had slowed that impulse, stretched it thin until it lost its power. I began to see urgency as a warning signal rather than a guide. The more pressured a decision feels, the more likely it is driven by fear. That insight seeped into every area of my life. I stopped overcommitting. I stopped explaining choices that didn't require consensus. I stopped mistaking intensity for truth. The money, still largely untouched, became symbolic rather than central. It represented not indulgence, but insulation. It allowed me to make decisions based on alignment instead of survival. I invested some of it thoughtfully, supporting causes and ideas that mattered to me, not to impress anyone, but because I could. The rest remained where it was, a reminder that I didn't need to prove anything. Occasionally, people asked about it, rumors traveling faster than facts ever do. I smiled and changed the subject. Power doesn't need to announce itself. Michael Grant crossed my mind from time to time, not as a benefactor, but as a catalyst. He had understood something I hadn't yet learned when we met. That removing urgency changes outcomes. He hadn't intervened to save me or punish anyone. He had intervened to slow the story down, to give it space to reveal itself fully. That perspective reshaped how I understood agency. Waiting isn't passive when it's intentional. It's a choice, and like all choices, it carries responsibility. I took responsibility for how I waited, for what I observed, for how I changed. There were moments of grief, of course, not for Daniel exactly, but for the version of myself that had believed endurance was a virtue in itself. I let that grief exist without dramatizing it. It passed the way most honest emotions do, quietly, when they're allowed to be felt without judgment. As my life settled into something steadier, I noticed how differently I was treated. People listened more carefully when I spoke. They didn't interrupt as often. They didn't assume access. That shift wasn't about status or money. It was about boundaries. Waiting had taught me how to hold them without aggression. I wasn't harder. I was clearer. That clarity was magnetic in a way I hadn't expected. Opportunities appeared that felt aligned rather than demanding. Conversations deepened without effort. I stopped trying to be understood and started prioritizing understanding myself. Looking back, I could see how easily this story could have ended differently. I could have divorced immediately, fueled by anger and fear, carrying unresolved questions into the next chapter of my life. Instead, I waited, not because I was weak, but because I was willing to tolerate discomfort in service of truth. That choice changed everything. I didn't come out of the experience triumphant or vindicated. I came out aware of my patterns, my limits, my capacity for restraint, aware of how much power lives in the space between impulse and action. Waiting taught me that endings don't have to be rushed to be real. Sometimes the most decisive thing you can do is pause long enough to see clearly as the months passed. I began to understand that the most permanent changes are rarely announced. They settle in quietly, altering how you respond to situations you once found overwhelming. I noticed it in small moments. A disagreement that didn't trigger defensiveness. An unexpected challenge that didn't send me searching for reassurance. A compliment that I accepted without shrinking or deflecting. These were not dramatic victories, but they marked a fundamental shift. Waiting had recalibrated my internal standards, and I was no longer willing to negotiate them away for comfort or familiarity. Daniel faded into the background of my life more quickly than I expected, not because I forced distance, but because relevance requires engagement and I no longer offered it. His occasional attempts to resurface, framed as concern or nostalgia, landed without weight. I wished him no harm, but I also wished him no access. That distinction felt important. Closure, I learned, isn't something someone gives you. It's something you establish by deciding where your attention ends. I turned my focus toward building a life that reflected who I was now, not who I had been trying to accommodate. I took on projects that challenged me intellectually rather than emotionally. I surrounded myself with people who didn't require translation or management. The ease of those relationships was startling. There was no constant calibration, no quiet tallying of needs. Mutual respect did most of the work. I thought often about how much energy I'd spent in the past anticipating reactions, smoothing potential conflict before it appeared. That vigilance had felt like love at the time. Now it felt like labor I would never volunteer for again. The money became less abstract as time went on, not because I spent it freely, but because it stopped feeling like a secret. I integrated it into my life thoughtfully, supporting initiatives that aligned with my values, investing in long-term stability rather than short-term gratification. Each decision was deliberate, not reactive. I understood now why Michael Grant had been so precise in his request. Waiting had trained me to think in terms of consequences rather than impulses. That mindset extended far beyond the original situation. It influenced how I approached work, friendships, even rest. I no longer rushed to fill space or resolve tension. I allowed things to unfold, trusting my ability to respond when clarity arrived. That trust was new, and it felt like strength rather than risk. People sometimes asked if I regretted not leaving immediately, if the waiting had been a form of self-denial. I answered honestly. Waiting had been uncomfortable, but hadn't been self-sacrifice. It had been self-respect in a form I hadn't previously recognized. It required discipline, not passivity. It demanded that I sit with uncertainty without trying to control it. That skill, once learned, was transferable. I applied it everywhere. When faced with decisions that once would have sent me spiraling, I paused. I gathered information. I observed patterns. I let time reveal what urgency tried to obscure. The results spoke for themselves. My choices became cleaner, less entangled with fear or approval. I stopped mistaking intensity for importance. Looking back, I could see how the affair had been a catalyst rather than the core of the story. The betrayal had exposed vulnerabilities, but the waiting had addressed them. It had taught me how to hold my ground without aggression, how to disengage without resentment, how to move forward without needing validation. Those lessons stayed with me, shaping a new standard for what I would accept and what I would no longer tolerate. I wasn't harder or more cynical. If anything, I was more generous with my energy because I was no longer wasting it on people who couldn't meet me with respect. I found myself laughing more easily, sleeping more deeply, trusting my instincts without second-guessing them. The calm that others had noticed early on wasn't a phase. It was a foundation. Waiting had given me that foundation, solid and unshakable. I didn't know what the next chapters of my life would hold, and for the first time, that uncertainty felt expansive rather than threatening. I had learned how to wait without losing myself, how to pause without stagnating. That knowledge changed how I approached everything that followed. The story that began with betrayal ended with alignment, not because I rushed to close it, but because I allowed it the time it needed to tell the truth. By the time a full year had passed since that Tuesday morning, the story no longer felt like something that had happened to me. It felt like something I had moved through deliberately, collecting pieces of myself along the way that I hadn't realized were missing. Strength, I learned, doesn't always look like confrontation or decisive action. Sometimes it looks like restraint, so complete it confuses people who expect drama. I carried that understanding into everything I did. When challenges arose, I no longer reacted with urgency. I paused, not out of indecision, but out of confidence that clarity would arrive if I allowed space for it. That approach changed how people interacted with me. They sensed it, even if they couldn't articulate why. Conversations slowed. Assumptions softened. I was no longer someone to rush or pressure. Daniel, for his part, tried one last time to regain relevance. It came in the form of an apology letter, carefully written, thoughtful in tone, arriving months after the divorce had settled. He spoke of growth, of lessons learned, of regret. I read it once and then filed it away. Not because it was meaningless, but because it no longer required my response. I had reached a place where acknowledgement did not equal engagement. That distinction marked real freedom. I didn't need to punish him or forgive him to move on. I'd already done the work that mattered. The waiting had carried me past the point where his understanding was necessary. My life expanded in ways that felt organic rather than compensatory. I didn't chase reinvention or seek to prove anything. I simply followed what felt aligned. I took on work that challenged me intellectually and allowed me to contribute meaningfully without sacrificing myself. That I invested in relationships that were reciprocal, where presence was valued without being demanded. The ease of those connections reinforced what I had learned. Love does not require constant negotiation. Respect does not need reminders. The money, still a quiet presence, became part of the architecture of my life rather than its focal point. I used it to build stability, to support ideas and people I believed in, to create a buffer that allowed me to remain patient in a world that rewards haste. I understood now why urgency is so often mistaken for importance. Urgency bypasses discernment. Waiting restores it. That insight became my compass. When faced with opportunities that once would have felt irresistible, I asked different questions. Does this align with who I am now? Does it require me to shrink or perform? If the answer wasn't clear, I waited. More often than not, the answer revealed itself without effort. People around me noticed the consistency, the steadiness. They commented on it, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with admiration. I didn't explain it. The explanation was lived, not spoken. Michael Grant never re-entered my life, and that felt appropriate. His role had been specific and finite. He had intervened not to direct my outcome, but to create conditions where I could choose it for myself. That gift changed how I viewed power. Real power doesn't force outcomes. It creates space for truth to emerge. Waiting had been my education in that kind of power. I no longer feared endings or beginnings. I understood them as transitions that didn't require haste. When something no longer fit, I let it go without spectacle. When something new appeared, I approached it without desperation. That balance made my life feel spacious, grounded. Looking back, I could see how easily I might have missed this transformation if I had rushed to escape discomfort. Pain has a way of demanding immediate resolution. Waiting asks something harder. It asks you to trust yourself enough to stay present while the story unfolds. That trust became my greatest asset. I didn't emerge louder or more aggressive. I emerged clearer. And clarity has a gravity of its own. It draws the right things closer and pushes the wrong things away without effort. As I moved forward, I carried one quiet certainty with me. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would meet them without haste, without fear, and without abandoning myself. The woman who had once believed endurance was her greatest strength had learned something deeper. Strength isn't about how much you can tolerate. It's about knowing when to wait, when to act, and when to walk away without looking back. Something subtle but profound happens when you stop needing external confirmation that you did the right thing. It doesn't arrive with relief so much as with steadiness. I noticed it one afternoon when I was asked for advice by someone who had no idea what I'd been through. She spoke about her own marriage, about uncertainty and betrayal, and the pressure to decide quickly before things got worse. As she talked, I realized I wasn't responding from theory or optimism. I was responding from experience. I told her something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself until that moment. Urgency is rarely your friend. It often belongs to the person who benefits most from your confusion. She looked at me as if I'd given her permission to breathe. That was when I understood how deeply the waiting had changed me. It wasn't just about my story anymore. It was about how I moved through the world and how others responded to that movement. Authority, I learned, doesn't come from dominance or certainty projected outward. It comes from alignment, from knowing why you choose what you choose and being willing to let others misunderstand you while you do it. I had spent years trying to make myself legible to people who benefited from my self-doubt. Waiting broke that habit. It taught me that being understood is optional. Being clear with yourself is not. Daniel eventually stopped reaching out altogether, not because he had found peace, but because there was nothing left to extract from the connection. No reaction, no reassurance, no access. I didn't celebrate that distance. I simply respected it. The absence of chaos was not something I needed to replace with new drama. I was content to let calm be sufficient. That contentment surprised people. They expected reinvention, transformation that could be seen and measured. They expected anger or triumph or visible closure. What they got instead was continuity without compromise. I didn't become someone else. I became more precisely myself. My days settled into a rhythm that felt intentional. Work that challenged me without consuming me. Relationships that felt mutual rather than managed. Solitude that felt nourishing rather than lonely. I stopped explaining my choices preemptively. If someone questioned my pace or my boundaries, I listened without absorbing the doubt. Waiting had taught me that skepticism from others doesn't require defense. It requires discernment. Not every opinion deserves consideration. That realization alone freed an enormous amount of energy. The money, by now fully integrated into my life, became almost invisible in its influence. It didn't change my taste so much as it changed my tolerance. I no longer accepted environments or expectations that required me to shrink. I invested in spaces that honored thoughtfulness over speed, depth over display. That approach mirrored the lesson I'd learned at the beginning of this story. When you remove urgency, you remove manipulation. People reveal themselves when they believe time is on their side. I watched this play out repeatedly in business, in friendships, in negotiations. Those who pressured revealed insecurity. Those who waited revealed confidence. I aligned myself with the latter. Occasionally, I thought back to the woman I had been on that Tuesday morning, staring at a phone and feeling her life collapse. I felt compassion for her now, not pity. She had done the best she could with the tools she had. Waiting had given her better ones. It had taught her how to sit with discomfort without being consumed by it, how to observe without disengaging, how to choose without rushing. Those skills became the foundation of everything that followed. I didn't romanticize the pain or the betrayal. I didn't need to. The value wasn't in what happened. It was in how I responded once I stopped reacting. That distinction mattered more than any outcome. When people asked me what I would do differently if given the chance, I answered honestly. I wouldn't change the waiting. It gave me back my agency in a way nothing else could have. It taught me that time, when used deliberately, is not something you lose. It's something you invest. And like all good investments, it compounds quietly, revealing its worth over time. I carried that understanding forward, not as a rule, but as a reference point. Whenever I felt pressure to decide, to commit, to explain, I paused. I asked myself whose urgency I was responding to. More often than not, the answer clarified everything. The waiting had ended long ago, but the lesson remained active. I was no longer someone who rushed to close chapters out of fear. I was someone who allowed them to conclude naturally with integrity intact. That, more than anything, became my quiet authority as time went on. I stopped thinking of what happened as something extraordinary and started recognizing it as something precise. The events themselves were dramatic only on the surface. Beneath that, the real shift had been subtle, almost unremarkable, which is why it lasted. I didn't wake up one day feeling healed or victorious. I woke up feeling settled. That was how I knew the story had reached its natural conclusion. There was nothing left to resolve, no unanswered questions tugging at me in quiet moments. The waiting had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had stripped the situation of urgency and left only truth behind. I had seen my marriage clearly, not through the lens of shock or grief, but through sustained observation. I had seen myself clearly, too, without the distortion of fear or habit. That clarity stayed with me. It informed how I spoke, how I listened, how I chose. I no longer felt the need to narrate my life to others or justify its direction. When people asked what happened, I gave them the short version. When they asked how I felt, I told them I was at peace. Some believed me, some didn't. That stopped mattering. Peace doesn't require consensus. It requires alignment. I noticed how often people tried to rush their own endings, desperate to close doors before they fully understood what they were walking away from. I recognized that impulse because it had once been mine. Now I understood its cost. Ending things quickly can feel decisive, but it often leaves fragments behind. Waiting, when done intentionally, gathers those fragments and returns them to you intact. I didn't wait because I was indecisive. I waited because I was learning. That distinction changed everything. The story people expected, the explosive confrontation or the dramatic revenge, never came. Instead, what unfolded was quieter and far more permanent. A recalibration of self-respect, a redefinition of boundaries, A refusal to be rushed into conclusions that benefited someone else's comfort more than my own truth. The money, which had once seemed like the most unbelievable part of the story, faded into the background as the least important element. It had served its purpose by removing pressure, not by creating spectacle. What remained was something far more valuable: the ability to sit with uncertainty without collapsing into it. The confidence to let time reveal what impulse tries to hide. I carried that ability forward into every area of my life. When faced with decisions, I no longer asked what would make the situation end fastest. I asked what would make it end cleanest. That question became my compass. Some choices took longer. Some relationships dissolved slowly rather than abruptly. Some opportunities revealed themselves only after others fell away. I trusted the process because I trusted myself. That trust had been earned in the waiting. Looking back, I could see how easily this story could have ended differently. I could have left in pain, carrying unanswered questions and unresolved patterns into whatever came next. Instead, I stayed long enough to understand what I was leaving and why. That understanding became the foundation for everything that followed. I didn't need to demonize Daniel or absolve him. He became what he always was, clearly defined at last. I didn't need to justify my choices or defend my timeline. The results spoke quietly for themselves. My life became simpler, not because it was smaller, but because it was no longer cluttered with compromises I resented. I slept better. I listened more carefully. I spoke less, but with greater precision. People noticed. They often mistook that change for confidence. It wasn't confidence exactly. It was certainty. Certainty doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand agreement. It simply stands. As this chapter closed, I felt no urge to frame it as a lesson or a warning for others. It was enough to know what it had given me. I had learned that patience, when chosen deliberately, is not passive. It is an act of self-respect. I had learned that time can be an ally when you stop trying to control its outcome. And I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is wait long enough to see the truth and then walk away without needing anyone's permission. The story didn't end with a dramatic gesture or a final confrontation. It ended the way it should have, quietly, with me standing firmly in my own life, no longer waiting for anything at all.